In this video, we're going to make a simple, modern login page using Tailwind CSS. To make this page, I'll be using a Svelte web app in Visual Studio Code, but this of course can be done in any framework or just plain HTML as well. To get started, you just need to add Tailwind to your environment by following the instructions on their website. Here's all the different frameworks they easily install into, or you could just use their CLI, or they also just have a CDN URL you can use and add that JavaScript file to your HTML page. But once you have it available in your project, you can just use their classes to apply any CSS style to your elements. One thing to be aware of first is that by adding Tailwind, most existing default styles are removed. So margins are stripped out, borders are set to 0, headings look like plain text, and so on. For example, if you look at the starting HTML I have here, we just have an H1 heading and a form input. But if we check out the page currently, the heading looks normal and the text input is unnoticeable due to the border being gone. But this also allows us to restyle it the way we want and not the way the different browsers handle it. And if you're worried about having to repeat yourself because of this, like having to add classes to every one of your inputs, you can work around this by turning things like this into a reusable part of code in whatever language you're using. Like in Svelte, what I use, I can make my form inputs a component, style it in there, and just import that component whenever I need to use the form input. And I'll only need to maintain that style in that one place. But let's get working on our login screen. I'm going to start off with a div that will fill the entire page, and this will mainly be for the image background and to center the login box. To make this div fill the screen in Tailwind, you can add the classes h-svh and wfull. And since I have the Tailwind VS Code plugin installed, notice how I have autocomplete suggestions available. And you can also hover over the class and see what style it actually applies in the background. So here, the h-svh is short for height 100 of the screen view height, and with full is just short for width 100% in regular CSS. Next, let's add a background image. You do that by adding the bg class, a dash, and the normal CSS value in square braces. The square braces following a Tailwind class name lets you put any value you want for that CSS property. Tailwind typically has most of the values you want already turned into a class, but just in case, you can always specify your own values with the square braces. So here I'm just pointing it to a background image I already have in the root of my site. And to make sure it fills the page, I'm going to add the bg cover class. And again, if we hover over it to see what this does, it just adds the standard CSS background cover property. Then we'll center it with bg center, and you turn off repeating with bg no repeat. And let's check it out to see what we got so far. As you can see here, we have a nice image that fills the screen. And let's go ahead and move these side by side for now so we can see the changes live as we add each class. Now let's add a login box that's centered in the screen. In our main div, I'm going to add another div. For now, let's make the background black, but with a 60% opacity. And this is the Tailwind shortcut for doing that. You just add a slash and then a value after it. And then we'll make it around 350 pixels wide by using the width or W class. And here's another example of using a custom value in square braces. You can see here though, that for the width, there's lots of other pre-made ones you can pick as well. Let's set a minimum height of 1/4 of the screen, and that's pretty easy to do with min-h-1/4. We'll give the edge a border radius using the rounded class, and they have different sizes for that. We'll pick LG for large. And now we need to worry about centering it. To do that, I use the flexbox system, and we can make the parent div a flexbox by just using the flex class. And to use the align items and justify content CSS styles in Tailwind, we just type align followed by the direction. So here we want center, and then also justify and the direction. And this should center it in the parent div now. Now I don't think the black really matches the color of the image. I'm going to go change the black to a custom hex code that I've already picked out ahead of time. So we'll remove the word black, but keep the /60 for the opacity. And we can add our custom hex code like this in the square braces. And this looks much better, I think. I also want to blur this box, so it's easier to read the text that'll be on it. And we can do that in Tailwind with backdrop-blur and then a size, and we're going to pick a small blur. And notice how much CSS this is really applying for us. And this is where Tailwind really is handy, because it'll handle all the browser differences too for special things like backdrop blurring. Then to get ready for the contents, let's add some padding. In Tailwind, that's with the P class. And we'll pick 8, which is equal to 32 pixels, as you can see here. All the text inside will be white and centered, and we use the text classes for both of those. Now in the box, let's add a heading for the welcome message. We'll make the heading big by changing the font size, and in Tailwind, that's done with the text class again. We'll add a size of 3XL, and then to separate it from the login boxes, let's add a margin to the bottom. In Tailwind, the shortcut for margin bottom is just MB, and then an amount, and we'll pick 4, which is 16 pixels. Then below that, let's add a div that'll say email. We'll make it smaller and a little lighter by giving it a 60% opacity with the opacity class. I also want to counteract the centered text in the parent by adding text left. Next will be the login box. I want to put an icon in the box, so let's wrap it all in a div so that'll be possible. The div has to be position relative in order to have an absolute positioned icon element in it, and that shortcut is just the word relative. Then we give it some space at the bottom, like with the heading, with MB4. In this div, let's add a text input. To add the border back, we just say border, and then we can also specify a color. So we want to do border white, and I want the border to be a little lighter, so we can add the opacity to it as well with the slash and then an amount at the end. Then we'll add the border radius with the rounded class, and we'll make it 100% width with W full. Finally, let's make it a little larger by simply adding some padding with the P class. Now for the icon, I like to use Tabler. If you go to their site and search for user, you'll see lots of options. If you click on one and then click on more variants, you can adjust the thickness of it before using it, and I'm going to use the 1.5 version. Then we'll just copy the SVG code and paste it into our app below the login box. To get it to hover inside the box, we can clear the current classes as they don't really do anything, and then we can absolutely position it using the word absolute. We can use the right class to set its right position, and the bottom position using the bottom class. And then we can make it a little bit lighter with opacity. And then we can just move it over one extra step from the right. We can then do the same thing with the password, so I'll just go ahead and copy the entire email part. We'll change the label, change the input type, and go back to Tabler and get a lock icon for that, and just move the same classes over from the user icon. Below those, we can add our sign-in button. We'll just add a submit button element. For the class, we'll have a white background, black text, maybe a little bit more bold, so we can do text semi-bold, a little bit of padding, just like the inputs, rounded, and we'll set a minimum width with min-w and then a value. For the button, I also want an icon next to the text, so let's go grab a login icon from Tabler. This only needs to be opaque as we're going to position them with Flexbox. In the button, let's add flex to set display flex for it, and justify center to center both items in there. And then use the Tailwind class gap to set the flex gap, so they're a little bit more spaced apart. And notice now though we lost our centering by making this a flex box, so we can recenter it with margins instead. And Tailwind has an MX auto to do just that. And you can see the style this is actually applying here. Also, our button doesn't have the pointer cursor like you'd normally see. We got to add that back manually. And the cursor pointer class does that. Then last thing for this button is to make it look a little bit different when you hover over it. In Tailwind, you can target hover states by just typing hover and a colon, and then the class you want to apply when hovered. So we can add hover colon opacity 80 to make it a little bit more opaque when you mouse over it, like this. We can also do transitions with Tailwind. Let's make our button grow a little bit bigger too when you hover. To do that, we can add the transition class, a duration class with a timing amount, and let's pick 300 milliseconds. And then a CSS timing function like ease in and out can just be added by adding ease in out class. Then we can add more hover classes, such as translate Y and an amount to move it, and 1 is for 4 pixels. And then we can scale it with scale and then an amount, and this would be a %. In Tailwind, you can also make any value negative, that can be negative, by adding a minus before the class. So to make the translate Y go in the opposite direction, we can just add a minus sign here. The same can happen for negative padding or anything else, so you can do minus P-2, for example, and so on. And now here's the animation if you hover over the button. Now down below, let's add a pretend link to create an account. We'll just use a normal link, but we'll have to manually set the cursor pointer, just like we did with the button. And for the color, let's pick a blue color that would be similar to the sky in our background image. You can check out all the built-in colors in Tailwind on their website. Here's all the different options, and the different shades are chosen by using the number up on top here. These colors can be applied to text with the text class, or backgrounds with the BG class, or borders with the border class, and so on. Basically anything that can take a color, you can append these colors and the shade at the end of it. So in our app, let's start typing text-blue, and here are all the different blue options. We'll pick 200 for a light blue. And we'll maybe make it a little bit smaller with text SM. And there we go. Looks pretty nice, I think. Now this looks pretty good on a larger screen, like a tablet or bigger, but it might have too much padding on cell phones like this. And we also maybe want to make the heading a little smaller so it doesn't wrap on super small screens. Tailwind is a mobile-first CSS framework, so that just means that any classes we've been using will apply to smaller screens first by default. And if we want to make it look different on a phone compared to a desktop, we need to specify the desktop version separately. And let's work on that now. To adjust the padding in our login box for cell phones, we first need to change our padding to what we want it to be for a cell phone. So up in the parent, let's change P8 to P4 instead. Then we can re-specify the larger padding for larger screens by typing MD: and then the P8. The MD will target medium screens or larger. There's also a large, which will target large screens. And there's a SM, which will target small screens or larger too, depending on what you need. If we change the window size now, you'll see the padding changes once we reach a certain screen size. When it reaches that point, let's also make the login box almost full width. And we can set the width here to be 90% instead, and then make the 350 pixel version only apply on medium screens. We can do something similar for the header now. Let's change the text 3XL to what we want for mobile. So maybe XL. And then re-specify the large version with medium dash or medium colon text 3XL. And now the text changes as well. But let's make it maybe one step bigger to 2XL. Now, if we wanted, we can animate the login box growing and shrinking too, but this will require a bit of customization to Tailwind, but that'll be okay as it gives me an excuse to show you how to do that. So if we add our transition, duration, and ease classes to our login box div, you'll see that the resizing still isn't animated. That's because if we check out the transition class by hovering over it, the background CSS doesn't touch any widths. But Tailwind lets you do some advanced things if you want. We can extend this class's capabilities by having a tailwind.config.ts or JS file in the root of your site. Here we can type out a module.exports function Tailwind will look for. And in there we have a theme object, an extend object, and a transition property object. And here we can tell it to also look for a new variant of the class called size. And we'll have that apply to things like left or width or the height and so on. Then back in our code, we can just add -size to our transition class. And if we try it now, changes to the width are now animated. That config file lets you do many other things as well. A common thing I use it for is for setting custom colors. Like if I have a specific palette I want to use for a business, I'll put the colors in there, and then I can just use them by name, like we did with the blue -200 for the link. And that's about it for a basic yet nice looking login page. You can check out Tailwind's site or just Google it if you're ever stuck on what class to use for a specific style. And then eventually you'll, of course, start memorizing them. If you have any questions on this, though, please let me know in the comments, and thanks for checking it out.